Signs. Pia went to bed early again. Not having slept much the night before, Kanai tried to do the same, but despite his best efforts, sleep proved elusive for him that night. There was a strong wind blowing outside, and as if in response to the Botboti's rocking, a recurrent childhood nightmare came back to visit him, a dream in which he was taking the same examination over and over again. The difference now was in the faces of the examiners, which were not those of his teachers, but of Kusum and Pia, Nilima and Moina, Horen and Nirmal. In the small hours he sat up suddenly in a sweat of anxiety. He could not remember what language he had been dreaming in, but the word Barishka, examination, was ringing in his head, and he was trying to explain why he had translated the word in the archaic sense of trial by ordeal. Eventually, these dreams yielded to a deep, heavy sleep which kept him in his bunk until the dawn fog had lifted and the tide was about to reverse itself. Kanai stepped out of his cabin to find that the wind had died down, leaving the river's becalmed surface as still as a sheet of polished metal. Having reached full flood, the tide was now at that point of perfect balance when the water appears motionless. From the deck, the island of Gargentola looked like a jeweled inlay on the rim of a gigantic silver shield. The spectacle was at once elemental and intimate, immense in its scale, and yet in this moment of tranquillity, oddly gentle. He heard footsteps on the deck and turned to see Pia coming towards him. She was armed with a clipboard and data sheets, and her voice was all business. Can I ask you a favor? For this morning? Certainly. Tell me, what can I do for you? I need you to do some spotting for me, Pia replied. The timing of the tides had created a small problem for her, Pia said. Her original plan had been to follow the dolphins when they left the pool at high tide, but right now the flood seemed to be setting in early in the morning and late in the evening. This meant the animals would be migrating in the dark. Tracking them would be hard enough during the day. Without good light, it would be impossible. What she had decided to do instead was to make a log of the routes they followed when they came back to the pool. Her plan was to post watches at the two approaches to the pool, one upstream and one downstream. She would take the upstream watch on the Mega. The river was wide there and it would be difficult to cover it without binoculars. Fakir could take the other watch in his boat. If Kanai could join him, so much the better. To have two pairs of eyes on the boat would compensate for the lack of binoculars. It means you'll have to spend a few hours in the boat with Fakir, said Pia. But that's not a problem, is it? Kanai was affronted to think she had the impression that he was somehow in competition with Fakir. No, he said quickly, not at all. I'll be glad to have a chance to talk to him. Good, that's settled then. We'll get started after you've had something to eat. I'll knock on your door in an hour. By the time Pia came to get him, he had breakfasted and was ready to go. In preparation for a day under the sun, he had changed into a light-colored trousers, a white shirt, and sandals. He had also decided to take along a cap and sunglasses. These preparations met with Pia's approval. Better bring these as well, she said, handing him 2 bottles of water. It's going to get very hot out there. They went together to the Mega cistern and found Fakir ready to leave with his oars placed crosswise across the gunwales. After Kanai had gone over to the smaller boat, Pia showed Fakir exactly where he was to position himself. The spot was about 2 kilometers downstream of the Mega, at a point where Gargentola curved outwards, jutting into the river so that the channel narrowed. The river's only a kilometer wide over there, said Pia. I figure that if you anchor at midstream, you'll have all the approaches covered between the two of you. Then she turned to point upstream where the river's mouth opened into a vast Mahona. I'll be over there, said Pia. As you can see, it's very wide, but being on the Mega, I'll have some elevation. With my binoculars, I'll be able to keep it covered. We'll be about 4 kilometers apart. I'll be able to see you, but you probably won't be able to see me. She waved as Fakir cast off the boat's moorings. Cupping her hands around her mouth, she shouted, "If it gets to be too much for you, Kanai, just tell Fakir to bring you back." "I'll be fine," said Kanai, waving back. "Don't worry about me." The boat had not gone very far when puffs of black smoke began to spur from the Mega's funnel. Slowly the Botboti began to move, and for several minutes Fakir and Kanai were shaken by the turbulence of its bow wave. Only when it had disappeared from view was the water calm again. Now, with the landscape emptied of other human beings, it was as if the distance between Kanai and Fakir had been reduced 100-fold. Yet if the boat had been 2 kilometers in length, they could not have been farther apart. Kanai was in the bow, and Fakir was in the stern behind the hood. Separated by the thatch, neither of them could see the other, and for their first couple of hours on the water, very little was said. Kanai made a couple of attempts to break the silence and was answered on each occasion with nothing more than a perfunctory grunt. Around noon, when the level of the water had begun to ebb, Fakir jumped to his feet in great excitement and pointed downriver. "Oh Jai, over there." Shading his eyes, Kanai spotted a sharply raked dorsal fin arcing through the water. "You'll see better if you hold on to the hood and stand up." "All right." Kanai made his way to the boat's midsection, pulled himself to his feet, and steadied his balance by leaning on the hood. "Another one, over there." Guided by Fakir's finger, Kanai spotted another fin slicing through the water. This was followed in quick succession by 2 more dolphins, all of them spotted by Fakir. This flurry of activity seemed to have created a small opening in the barrier of Fakir's silence, so Kanai made another attempt to draw him into conversation. "Tell me something, Fakir," he said, glancing down the length of the hood. "Do you remember Sar at all?" Fakir shot him a glance and looked away. "No," he said. "There was a time when he used to visit us, but I was very small then. After my mother died, I hardly ever saw him. I hardly remember him at all." "And your mother? Do you remember her?" "How could I forget her? Her face is everywhere." He said this in such a plain, matter-of-fact way that Kanai was puzzled. "What are you saying, Fakir? Where do you see her face?" He smiled and began to point in every direction, to the ends of the compass as well as to his head and feet. Here, 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 everywhere. The phrasing of this was so simple to the point of being childlike, and it seemed to Kanai that he had finally understood why Moina felt so deeply tied to her husband, despite everything. There was something about him that was utterly unformed, and it was this very quality that drew her to him. She craved it in the same way the potter's hands might crave the resistance of unshaped clay. "So tell me then, Fakir, do you ever feel like visiting a city?" It was only after he had spoken that he realized that he had inadvertently addressed Fakir as Tui, as though he were indeed a child, but Fakir seemed not to notice. "This is enough for me," he said. What'll I do in a city?" He picked up his oars as if to mark the end of the conversation. "Now it's time to go back to the Botboti." The boat began to rock as Fakir dipped his oars, and Kanai retreated quickly to his place in the bow. After sitting down, he looked up to see that Fakir had moved to the boat's midsection, seating himself so that he would be facing Kanai as he rowed. In the steaming midday heat, a haze was rising from the river, giving the impression of mirages dancing on the water. The heat and haze induced a kind of torpor in Kanai, and as if in a dream he had a vision of Fakir traveling to Seattle with Pia. He saw the two of them walking onto the plain, she in her jeans and he in his lungi and worn t-shirt. He saw Fakir squirming in his seat that was unlike any he had ever seen before. He pictured him looking up and down the aisle with his mouth agape, and then he thought of him in some icy western city, wandering the streets in search of work, lost and unable to ask for directions. He shook his head to rid himself of this discomforting vision. It seemed to Kanai that the boat was passing much closer to Gargantola than it had on the way out, but with the water at its lowest level, it was hard to know whether this was due to a deliberate change of course or to an optical illusion caused by the usual shrinkage of the river's surface at ebb tide. As they were passing the island Fokir raised a flattened palm to his eyes and peered at the sloping sandbank to their left. Suddenly he stiffened, rising slightly in his seat. As if by instinct, his right hand gathered in the hem of his unfurled lungi, tucking it between his legs, transforming the ankle-length garment into a loincloth. With his hand on the gunwale, he rose to a half-crouch, setting the boat gently sway, his torso inclining forward in the stance of a runner taking his mark. He raised a hand to point. "Look over there." "What's the matter?" said Kanai. "What do you see?" "Look!" Kanai narrowed his eyes as he followed Fokir's finger. He could see nothing of interest, so he said, "What should I look for?" "Signs. Marks, like we saw yesterday, a whole trail of them, running from the trees to the water and back." Kanai looked again and caught sight of a few depressions in the ground, but the bank at this point was colonized mainly by Stan of Garjon, a species of mangrove that breathed through spear-like ventilators connected by subterranean root systems. The surface of the bank was pierced by so many of these upthrust organs that it was impossible to distinguish between one mark and another. The depressions that had caught Fokir's eye looked nothing like the sharply defined marks of the night before. They seemed to Kanai to be too shapeless to signify anything in particular. They could just as well have been crabs' burrows or runnels formed by the retreating water. "See how they form a track?" Fokir said. "They go right to the edge of the water. That means they were made after the tide had ebbed, probably just as we were heading this way. The animal must have spotted us and come down to take a closer look." The thought of this, a tiger coming down to the water's edge in order to watch their progress across the Mahona, was just far-fetched enough to make Kanai smile. "Why would it want to look at us?" said Kanai. "Maybe because it smelled you," said Fokir. "It likes to keep an eye on strangers." There was something about Fokir's expression that convinced Kanai he was playing a game with him, perhaps unconsciously, and the thought of this amused him. Kanai understood all too well how the dynamics of their situation might induce Fokir to exaggerate the menace of their surroundings. He himself had often stood in Fokir's place, serving as some hapless traveler's window on an unfamiliar world. He remembered how in those circumstances he too had often been tempted to heighten the inscrutability of the surroundings through subtly slanted glosses. To do this required no particular malicious intent. It was just a way of underscoring the insider's indispensability. Every new peril was proof of his importance, each new threat evidence of his worth. These temptations were all too readily available to every guide and translator. Not to succumb was to make yourself dispensable. To give in was to destroy the value of your word, and thus your work. It was precisely because of his awareness of this dilemma that he knew too that there were times when a translator's bluff had to be called. Kanai pointed to the shore and made a gesture of dismissal. "Those are just burrows," he said, smiling. "I saw crabs digging into them." "What makes you think they have anything to do with the big cat?" Fokir turned to flash him a bright white smile. "Do you want to know how I know?" "Yes, tell me." Leaning over, Fokir took hold of Kanai's hand and placed it on the back of his neck. The unexpected intimacy of this contact sent a shock through Kanai's arm, and he snatched his hand back, but not before he had felt the goosebumps bristling on the moist surface of Fokir's skin. Fokir smiled at him again. "That's how I know," he said. "It's the fear that tells me." Rising to a crouch, Fokir directed a look of inquiry at Kanai. "And what about you?" he said. "Can you feel the fear?" These words triggered a response in Kanai that was just as reflexive as the goosebumps on Fakir's neck. The surroundings, the mangrove forest, the water, the boat were suddenly blotted from his consciousness. He forgot where he was. It was as though his mind had decided to revert to the functions for which it had been trained and equipped by years of practice. At that moment, nothing existed for him but language, the pure structure of sound that had formed Fakir's question. He gave this inquiry the fullest attention of which his mind was capable, and knew the answer almost at once. It was the negative, the truth that he did not feel the fear that had raised bumps on Fakir's skin. It was not that he was a man of unusual courage, far from it, but he knew also that fear was not contrary to what was often said, an instinct. It was something learned, something that accumulated in the mind through knowledge, experience, and upbringing. Nothing was harder to share than another person's fear, and at that moment he certainly did not share Fakir's. "Since you asked me," Kanai said, "I'll tell you the truth. The answer is no. I'm not afraid, at least not in the way you are." Like a ring spreading across a pool, a ripple of awakened interest passed over Fakir's face. "Then tell me," he said, leaning closer. "If you're not afraid, there's nothing to prevent you from taking a closer look, is there?" His gaze was steady and unblinking, and Kanai would not allow himself to drop his eyes. Fakir had just doubled the stakes, and it was up to him now to decide whether he would back down or call his bluff. "All right," Kanai said, not without some reluctance. "Let's go." Fakir nodded and turned the boat using a single oar. When the bow pointed towards the shore, he started to row. Kanai glanced across the water. The river was as calm as a floor of polished stone, and the currents etched on its surface appeared almost stationary, like the veins in a slab of marble. "Fakir, tell me something," said Kanai. "What?" "If you're afraid, then why do you want to go there, to that island?" "My mother told me," Fakir said, "that this was a place where you had to learn not to be afraid, and if you did, then you might find the answer to your troubles." "Is that why you came here?" "Who's to say?" He shrugged, smiling, and then he said, "Now can I ask you something, Kanai Babu?" He was smiling broadly, leading Kanai to expect he would make some kind of joke. "What?" "Are you a clean man, Kanai Babu?" Kanai sat up, startled. "What do you mean?" Fakir shrugged. "You know, are you good at heart?" "I think so," Kanai said. "My intentions are good anyways. As for the rest, who knows?" "But don't you ever want to know for sure?" "How can anyone know for sure?" "My mother used to say that here in Garjantola, Bon Bibi would show you whatever you wanted to know." "How?" Fakir shrugged again. "That's just what she used to say." As they drew closer to the island, a flock of birds took wing, breaking away from the upper level of the canopy and swirling in a cloud before settling down again. The birds were parrots of color, almost indistinguishable from the emerald tint of the mangroves. For a moment, when they rose in the air together, it was as though a green mane had risen from the treetops, like a wig lifted by a gust of wind. The boat picked up speed as it approached the bank, and Fakir's final stroke rammed the prow deep into the mud. Tucking his lungi between his legs, he dropped over the side of the boat and went running over the bank to examine the marks. "I was right," cried Fakir triumphantly, dropping to his knees. "These marks are so fresh they must have been made within the hour." To Kanai, the depressions looked just as shapeless as they had before. "I don't see anything," he said. "How could you?" Fakir looked up at the boat and smiled. "You're too far away. You'll have to get off the boat. Come over here and look. You'll see how they go all the way up. He pointed up the slope to the barrier of mangrove looming above. All right, I'm coming. Kanai was turning to jump when Fokir stopped him. No, wait! Roll up your pants and then take your slippers off, or else you'll lose them in the mud. It's better to be barefoot. Kanai kicked off his sandals and rolled his trousers up to his knees. Then, swinging his feet over the gunwale, he dropped over the side and sank into the mud. His body lurched forward and he reached quickly for the boat, steadying himself against the gunwale. To fall in the mud now would be a humiliation too painful to contemplate. He pulled his right foot carefully out of the mud and planted it a little way ahead. In this way, by repeating these childlike steps, he was able to get across to Fokir's side without mishap. Look, said Fokir, gesturing at the ground. Here are the claws, and there's the pad. He turned to point up the slope. And see, that's the way it went, past those trees. It might be watching you, even now. There was a mocking note in his voice that stung Kanai. He stood up straight and said, What are you trying to do, Fokir? Are you trying to frighten me? Frighten you? Said Fokir, smiling. But why would you be frightened? Didn't I tell you what my mother said? No one who is good at heart has anything to fear in this place. Then turning on his heel, Fokir went back to the boat across the mud bank and reached under the hood. When he straightened up again, Kanai saw that he had drawn out his da. As Fokir advanced towards him, blade in hand, Kanai recoiled reflexively. What's that for? He said, raising his eyes from the instrument's glistening edge. Don't be afraid, said Fokir. It's for the jungle. Don't you want to go and see if we can find the maker of these marks? Even in that moment of distraction, Kanai noticed, so tenacious were the habits of his profession, that Fokir was using a different form of address with him now. From the respectful apne that he had been using before, he had now switched to the same familiar tui Kanai had used in addressing him. It was as though in stepping onto the island, the authority of their positions had been reversed. Kanai looked at the tangled barrier of mangrove ahead and knew that it would be madness to walk into that with Fokir. His da could slip, anything could happen. It was not worth the risk. No, said Kanai. I'm not going to play this game with you anymore, Fokir. I want you to take me back to the Botpoti. But why? Said Fokir with a laugh. What are you afraid of? Didn't I tell you? A man like yourself should have nothing to fear in this place. Stepping into the mud, Kanai shouted over his shoulder, Stop talking nonsense. You may be a child, but I'm not. Then suddenly, it was as though the earth had come alive and was reaching for his ankle. Looking down, he discovered that a rope-like tendril had wrapped itself around his ankles. He felt his glance going, and when he tried to slide a foot forward to correct it, his legs seemed to move in the wrong direction. Before he could do anything to break the fall, the wetness of the mud slapped him full in the face. At first, he was completely immobile. It was as though his body were being fitted for a mold in a tub of plaster. Trying to look up, he discovered that he could not see. The mud had turned his sunglasses into a blindfold, scraping his head against his arm. He shook the glasses off and allowed them to sink out of sight. When Fokir's hand descended on his shoulder, he brushed it off and tried to push himself to his feet on his own. But the consistency of the mud was such as to create a suction effect, and he could not break free. He saw that Fokir was smiling at him. I told you to be careful. The blood rushed to Kanai's head and obscenities began to pour from his mouth. Shala! Banchor! Shoror Bacha! His anger came welling up with an atavistic explosiveness rising from sources whose very existence he would have denied. The master's suspicion of menial, the pride of caste, the townsman's mistrust of the rustic, the city's antagonism towards the village. He had thought he had cleansed himself of these sediments of the past. but the violence with which they spewed out of him now suggested that they had only been compacted into an explosive and highly volatile reserve. There had been occasions in the past, too many of them, when Kanai had seen his clients losing their temper in like fashion, when rage had made them cross the boundaries of selfhood, transporting them to a state in which they were literally beside themselves. The phrase was apt. Their emotions were so intense as almost to spill outside the physical boundaries of their skin, and almost always, no matter what the proximate cause, he was the target of their rage, the interpreter, the messenger, the amanuensis. He was the life preserver that held them afloat in a tide of incomprehension. The meaningless that surrounded them became, as it were, his fault, because he was its only named feature. He had survived these outbursts by telling himself that such episodes were merely a professional hazard, nothing personal. It was just that his job sometimes made him a proxy for the inscrutability of life itself. Yet, despite his knowledge of the phenomenon, he was powerless to stop the torrent of obscenities that were pouring out of his mouth now. When Fokir offered a hand to help him up, he slapped it aside. Ja! Shorar bacha! Baria ja! Get away from me, you son of a pig. All right then, said Fokir. I'll do as you say. Raising his head, Kanai caught a glimpse of Fokir's eyes, and the words withered on his lips. In Kanai's professional life there had been a few instances in which the act of interpretation had given him the momentary sensation of being transported out of his body and into another. In each instance, it was as if the instrument of language had metamorphosed instead of being a barrier, a curtain that divided, it had become a transparent film, a prism that allowed him to look through another set of eyes, to filter the world through a mind other than his own. These experiences had always come out unpredictably, without warning or apparent cause, and no thread of similarity linked these occasions, except that in each of them he had been working as an interpreter. But he was not working now, and yet it was exactly this feeling that came upon him as he looked at Fokir. It was as though his own vision were being refracted through those opaque, unreadable eyes, and he were seeing not himself, Kanai Dutt, but a great host of people, a double for the outside world. Someone standing in for the men who had destroyed Fokir's village, burned his home, and killed his mother. He had become a token for a vision of human beings in which a man such as Fokir counted for nothing, a man whose value was less than that of an animal. In seeing himself in this way, it seemed perfectly comprehensible to Kanai why Fokir should want him to be dead. Fokir had brought him here not because he wanted him to die, but because he wanted him to be judged. Kanai lifted a hand to wipe the mud from his eyes, and when he looked up again, he found that Fokir had stepped out of his field of vision. Something prompted Kanai to look back over his shoulder. Squirming in the mud, he turned just in time to see the boat slipping away. He could not see Fokir's face, only his back. He was in the stern, rowing vigorously. "Wait!" said Kanai. "Don't leave me here!" It was too late. The boat had already vanished around a bend. Kanai was watching the boat's bow wave, fanning across the river when he saw a ripple cutting slantwise over the water. He looked again carefully, and now it seemed certain that there was something beneath the water surface, obscured by the darkness of the silt. It was making for the shore, coming towards him. Kanai's head filled with visions of the ways in which the Tide country dealt out death. The tiger, people said, killed you instantly with a swipe of its forepaw, breaking the joint between your shoulder and neck. You felt no pain when it happened. You were dead already of the shock induced by the tiger's roar just before the moment of impact. There was undeniably a quality of mercy to this, to the human mind at least. Wasn't this why people who lived in close proximity with tigers so often regarded them as being something more than just animals? Because the tiger was the only animal that forgave you for being so ill at ease in your translated world. Or was it because tigers knew of the horror of reptilian death? It's the crocodile, he remembered, that most loves the water's edge. Crocodiles can move faster on mud than a man can on run grass. The clay doesn't impede them. Because of their sleek underbodies and their webbed feet, they can use their slipperiness to their advantage. A crocodile, it said, will keep you alive until you drown. It won't kill you on land. It'll drag you into the water while you're still breathing. Nobody finds the remains of people who were killed by crocodiles. Every other thought vanished from his mind. Rising to a crouch, he began to push himself backwards higher up the bank, unmindful of the rooted spear points raking his skin. As he retreated up the bank, the mud thinned and the mangrove's shoots grew taller and more numerous. He could no longer see the ripple in the water, but it did not matter. All he wanted was to get as far from the river as possible. Rising gingerly to his feet, he took a step, and almost immediately there was an excruciating pain in the arch of his foot. It was as though he had stepped on the point of a nail or on a shard of glass. In wrenching out his foot, he caught a glimpse of Mangrove's ventilator, sunk deep up in the mud. He had jabbed his foot directly into its spear-like point. Then he saw that the spores were everywhere around him, scattered like booby traps. The roots that connected them ran just below the surface, like camouflaged tripwires. The barrier of mangrove which had looked so tangled and forbidding from the boat now seemed a refuge, a safe haven. Picking his way through the minefield of ventilators, he went crashing into the vegetation. The mangrove branches were pliable and sinuous. They bent without breaking and snapped back like whips. When they closed around him, it was as if he had passed into the embrace of hundreds of scaly limbs. They grew so thick he could not see beyond a meter. The river disappeared from view as if it were not for the incline of the slope. He would have been unable to judge whether he was heading away from the water or not. Then all at once the barrier ended and he broke through to a grassy clearing dotted with a few trees and palms. He sunk to his knees. His clothes were in shreds and his body was covered in cuts and scratches. Flies were settling on his skin and clouds of mosquitoes were hovering above. He could not bring himself to look around the clearing. This was where it would be, if it was here on the island. But what was he thinking of? He could not recall the word, not even the euphemisms Fouquier had used. It was as if his mind in its panic had emptied itself of language. The sounds and signs that had served in combination as the sluices between his mind and his senses had collapsed. His mind was swamped by a flood of pure sensation. The words he had been searching for, the euphemisms that were the source of his panic, had been replaced by the thing itself, except that without words it could not be apprehended or understood. It was an artifact of pure intuition, so real that the thing itself could not have dreamed of existence so intensely. He opened his eyes, and there it was directly ahead, less than 100 meters away. It was sitting on its haunches, with its head up, watching him with its tawny, flickering eyes. The upper parts of its coat were of a color that shone like gold in the sunlight, but its belly was dark and caked with mud. It was immense, of a size greater than he could have imagined, and the only parts of his body that were moving were its eyes and the tip of its tail. At first his terror was such that he could not move a muscle. Then, collecting his breath, he pushed himself to his knees and began to move slowly away, edging backwards into the thickets of mangrove, keeping his eyes fixed on the animal, all the while watching the tip of its twitching tail. Only when the branches had closed around him did he rise to his feet. Turning around, he began to push his way through the enclosing greenery, oblivious now to the thorns and splinters that were tearing at his limbs. When at last he broke through to the mud bank, he fell forward on his knees and covered his eyes with his forearm as he tried to prepare himself for the moment of impact, for the blow that would snap the bones of his neck. "Can I?" The shouted sound of his name made him open his eyes just long enough to see Pia, Fokir, and Horan running towards him across the bank. Now once again he fell forward on the mud and his mind went dark. When next he opened his eyes, he was on his back in the boat, and a face that was taking shape above him, materializing slowly against the blinding brightness of the afternoon sun. Slowly he came to understand that it was Pia, that she had her hands under his shoulders and was trying to prop him up. "Kenai, are you okay?" "Where were you?" he said. I was alone so long on that island." "Kenai, you were there just 10 minutes," she said. "Apparently it was you who sent Fokir away. He came hurrying back to us and we came as quickly as we could." "I saw it, Pia. I saw the tiger." Now Horan and Fokir crowded around him too, so he added in Bangla, "It was there, the cat. I saw it." Horan shook his head. "There was nothing there," he said. "We looked, Fokir and I. We looked and saw nothing. And if it had been there, you wouldn't be here now." "It was there, I tell you." Kenai's body was shaking so much that he could hardly get the words out of his mouth. Pia took hold of his wrist in an effort to calm him. "Kenai," she said gently, "it's all right. You're safe now. We're with you." He tried to answer, but his teeth were chattering and his breath kept getting caught in his throat. "Don't try to talk," Pia said. "I've got a sedative in my first aid bag. I'll give it to you when we get to the Mega. What you need is a good rest. You'll feel much better afterwards."